Morning, everybody. Good to be here on a balmy day, heading towards midsummer. But the good news is it's exactly the same in Munich. So it's been pouring the rain there for weeks as well. So no changes. I think what I'm going to tell you over the next 20, 25 minutes or so is very common themes with what you heard from Peter. Maybe slightly different angles in some respects, but I think many common themes. I think I'd like to preface what I say, though. I mean, here we are in the UK. There is no doubt, and I have to look at the newspapers or listen to the BBC every morning, and you hear the skepticism about what's happening in Europe. Whether it be the Euro crisis, whether it be what's happening in the south versus what's happening in the north, etc., etc. I think there is one fundamental, and that is this is a time for the UK to be even more engaged in Europe rather than maybe slightly aside from it. And the reason I say that is that from an automotive point of view, there are many, many legislative discussions going on, whether they be standards, whether they be CO2 regulations, whether they be safety regulations. And to put it bluntly, as a European Union, we are all in this together. And from that point of view, being engaged with Europe rather than aside from Europe is absolutely, I think, fundamental as we go forward at the moment. But I think some common themes here. There are a lot of changes happening in the world. And those changes are at what we would call the macro level. We heard about urbanization in Peter's speech. Today, there are 250 million people or so living in 30 megacities in the world. Now, the good news is, here we are in London, the only megacity in Europe. Now, Paris likes to think they're a megacity, but by the way, they're not. London is the only one. By the way, there's only two in the United States, New York and Los Angeles. The rest are in the emerging world. And the emerging world of Asia, of South America, of places like, for example, Istanbul, on the borders of Europe, granted. But these are the rapidly urbanizing areas. Now, according to the United Nations, in the next 25 to 30 years, around 60% of the world's population will live in megacities. Now, whether that's 60% of 7 billion or 8 billion or 9 billion, it's a hell of a lot more people are going to live in cities. And if we think of London, and by the way, congestion is a bit of a problem in London, but congestion in places like Beijing or Shanghai or Mexico City or Buenos Aires or Tokyo are far, far worse. Now, as a car industry, we can view that as a major challenge, or we can view it as a major opportunity. And I think there are major opportunities here, some of which I'll touch on. The environment, enough said. CO2 legislation is a norm, and the environment is high on everyone's agenda. I don't think it is a passing fashion. I think it is something which is here to stay. None of us really know the interconnectivity of the world's climates and so on and so forth. But by the way, none of us can take the risk that whatever happens, we are influencing it. So the environment and what happens with that is clearly here to stay. Customer needs are changing. No doubt about it. If you went back 25 years, what a customer wanted from his car, the way he looked at his car, the way he purchased his car, his expectations of his car are vastly different to what he has today. There was a question in our media briefing earlier about, are quality standards where they need to be in the car industry? Well, first of all, we can all make improvements. But secondly, there's no really bad cars out there anymore. Cars are at a standard and will continue to improve with the technological innovation that we heard about from Peter over a very rapid period in the years ahead. And the customer needs are reflecting that. Equally, issues like car sharing, and I'll come back to that as well. And of course, politics. Now, we've talked a lot about the euro in the last hour or so. Now, the euro is not an economic program, it is a political program. And that's maybe one of the changes we've all began to, or the understandings that have happened. But politics are playing a very significant role, not only in all our general lives, but highly within the automotive industry. And all of that leads to a macro set of trends that are affecting everything we do in our industry today. Just reflecting on the UK, I'm delighted You know, I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I started, as Justin just said, in Longbridge, along with a few other people I can see in the room as well, particularly that one sitting over there, who's the head of purchasing at JLR these days. But what we have in the UK now, I think, is a very good set of steps towards a much stronger automotive industry again. We saw the statistics that show where the industry was, where it went down to, and where it's coming back. We as a company have invested very heavily. We have a very clear philosophy that production will follow sales. So this market is our fourth largest market in the world. It used to be the third. Mr. Abbott, sitting in the front row here, who's head of BMW in the UK. More to do, mate. But we can always use these things to motivate your own team as well. But being the fourth largest in the world, it is absolutely essential that we invest here. Like we're investing in the United States, like we're investing in South America, like we're investing in Asia, as well as, of course, within our core operations within Germany. So in the UK, we have around about 7,500 direct employees. If you multiply that up with the dealers, we have around 65, 70,000, and if you multiplied it up with our suppliers, a very significant, maybe approaching 100,000 or so people. But for me, seeing all the investment by all the other companies, and it's not just the Japanese, it is the JLRs of the world, it is the GMs of the world, I think gives us a confidence that there are steps in a very, very positive direction for the UK industry at this point in time. We are very encouraged that not only the last government, but the current government are carrying on the same policies of rebalancing the economy. Now, I often get asked the question, I've lived in Germany for almost 5 years now, why is the German economy so strong in terms of its exports, etc., etc.? Well, the simple answer to that, it is a very balanced economy. Now, here we are sitting in the middle of Canary Wharf, and there is no doubt the UK is one of the world leaders in financial services, and probably will remain so in the foreseeable future. But to be fair, over the 30 years I've been in the industry, we saw manufacturing really take a downward trend. And it became almost unfashionable. And if I looked at apprenticeships, now one of the plants I used to run in a previous life was what was originally the Wolseley car plant. And in my office, I had pictures going back to the 30s of the Wolseley workforce. Now, Paddy might remember some of this sitting over there, but you had probably 300-400 apprentices, and then you had the shop foreman, and then you had the manufacturing managers, and so on and so forth, right up to the guys who wore the bowler hats at the back. Now, social side hats and caps aside, but it was a very balanced environment, and working in manufacturing was a high part of society. I can tell you in Germany, it still is. And the apprentice in Germany, and we have 4,000 of them in BMW, have a very high position within their local communities and so on and so forth. I think the UK government has re-recognized that not everyone can go to university, that having a skill base which is able to deliver in a very competitive global environment is something which is fundamental to the success, because that brings technology, that brings R&D, that brings innovation, and ultimately that brings manufacturing and exports. And those elements, I think, are now much more to the fore than they were 15 or 20 years ago. And I'm delighted that the current government are carrying on where the last one left off. And programs like See Inside Manufacturing, the Automotive Council, I think, are really good steps along that way. By the way, though, this has to continue. This isn't just this government's term of office. This has to be the next government and the following behind that, because it will take more time. Now, there's been a lot of talk, and it started off with Chris's presentation, that the world is full of uncertainty and we don't really know what's going on. Well, we wouldn't wholly agree with that, but there is one uncertainty in that uncertain world, and that CO2 legislation in Europe, in Asia, and of course in the United States, and I mentioned that last, but more importantly, very significantly, are moving in the same direction. They are converging on a global scale, and that has never happened before. Now, as a global industry, we see frameworks around the world which wildly differ in many respects. But CO2 is moving in one very clear direction. CO2 is going to come down. Now, is this being driven by the consumer? Probably not. As Peter said, most people will say, do you want to help the environment? And they say, yes. When it comes to paying for some of it, the expectation is it's for free. But the legislative framework will drive this. And if you looked at, for example, the EU, and 95 grams is the current framework, it could go down further. And in some countries, if you looked at the Netherlands or Belgium in recent times, you see very significant shifts in CO2 because of local taxation. Bear in mind, they are all part of the EU, but they are driving their local economies with a taxation benefit. And the shift in the Netherlands has gone to less than 110 grams because there's up to 4,000 euros a year in the pocket of the individual, and money counts, as I said right at the start of this section. If I look at the United States, for the first time, we're going to see dramatic changes there. Now, it will move down by 5% or improve miles per gallon by 5% every year from 2015 to 2025, which will push the US fleet towards 50+ miles per gallon in 2025. Now, we all know that the best-selling car in America is an F-150 truck. And by the way, it doesn't do 50 miles to the gallon. Now, that will shift the whole framework of what is happening in the US market. And as I said, this has been driven by the legislative framework rather than the consumer behavior. But what it means to us as an industry is that there will be a requirement for some zero-emission vehicles within the mix in order to bring the averages down. Now, I buy into what Peter said, that the full battery electric vehicles will be a relatively small percentage of the overall industry. But I also believe that hybridization, and there are many definitions of hybridization, will be a much higher level. Maybe 25% of premium cars will be hybridized by 2020. And that, of course, goes from, as I say, defining it is always interesting, but stop-start motors is some form of hybridization, as, by the way, is electric driving and so on and so forth. For us as a manufacturer, we believe it has to have some form of electric driving involved, not just stop-start, where we have up to 5 million vehicles as BMW already on the world. But the other thing, here we are sat in Europe, there is going to be relatively little growth in the car industry in the mature markets of Europe. And in fact, at the moment, they are, as we saw earlier, moving backwards. There is maybe a little more growth in the United States, and that's a reflection of the demographics in the United States. But what you see here is those emerging countries. And this is BMW statistics, not industry statistics. And we saw very significant growth in Brazil, Russia, India, Korea, and Turkey. That's our definition of what we call BRICT. It excludes China, because China is in the major markets now. It is the biggest market in the world for the car industry, where we saw 38%. And what that tells you is there is a very strong shift for us as an industry into these emerging markets. And that, of course, comes with a lot more challenges as well. Now, very, very clearly, all of these economies have looked across at what they would see in China and said, in the last 10 years, they've become the biggest car industry in the world. They've got new factories, they've got tens of millions of people employed, they have technology, and the car industry rotates on a 7-year cycle for capital investment, and it therefore renews itself over that period. And guess what? They want their share of it. Now, you have extremes, like, for example, what has happened in Argentina, where overnight they said, if you want to import a car into Argentina, and it affects many UK companies, it does us as BMW, you have to export from the country. And by the way, it has to start today. So if it's a 10,000 euro car coming in tomorrow, you have to export 10,000 euros of Argentinian goods. So most of the European manufacturers are exporting agricultural products from Argentina. Peanuts, red wine, lots of red wine, in fact. It's quite nice, but you can only drink so much of it, as well as other things that are made domestically. And that, we could argue, is it WTO? And by the way, it is not WTO. It's not even within the Mercosur discussion, because it applies to Brazilian companies as well, but that's what they've decided to do. So we have to find creative solutions to it. If you looked at Brazil, on the other hand, they hiked their import duties by 30% on the 15th of December last year. The industry, as a result, has reduced dramatically. And what it tells you is that you see a lot of volatility in these countries as they adapt to finding ways of ensuring that they have their share of manufacturing, of R&D, of other automotive elements that we traditionally in the mature environments have looked as, well, maybe they should remain in certain countries. Now, as I said, we have a very clear philosophy of production will follow sales. So we're actively developing manufacturing sites in many of these places. But many of these places are also now taking the steps into R&D, taking the steps into design. So we now have 4 design houses in the world. A few years ago, we just had the one in Munich. And finding these solutions is very, very important in order to avoid the risk of not being part of the growth. And the message here is very clearly, the growth is in these countries, therefore finding these solutions is absolutely of key priority. For us, we believe equally the internal combustion engine has a long way to go. There is ample supply of fossil fuels as well. So, I did my degree in what would be more related to the oil industry. And at that time, the mid-70s, the oil industry said they had around 30 years of known reserves. Here we are in 2012, and they're saying we have about 30 years of known reserves. So there is plenty out there. One thing for certain, of course, it's going to get more expensive, because I spent time on North Sea oil rigs, and they were sat on the bottom at about 250 meters. If you look at the Gulf of Mexico, they were floating 2 kilometers off the shore, off the floor of the sea. And if you look at Brazil, they're floating 5 kilometers off the floor of the sea. So the technological leap to get the fossil fuels is going to be very, very costly. But the internal combustion engine and its improvements in technology and turboization, as well as, of course, the efficiency, are very, very important and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Hybrids and plug-ins will come, and electromobility will come, but full electric at a relatively small part. So for us, we are developing all of those technology. We have moved our CO2 credentials more than any other premium manufacturer, and we are very proud of that fact, but we're now on the next step. In terms of our full electric vehicles, it's a holistic approach. So we've chosen to make our electric vehicles, and we will be showing them in London, we'll be showing them at the Olympics, and they will be launched next year, out of carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is roughly 50% the weight of steel, 25% lighter than aluminium. And by the way, it's the first time a business case for carbon fiber works, because less weight means less batteries means less cost. And of course, that goes all the way through the process of doing it. And we're making our carbon fiber in Washington State on the west of the United States because they have hydroelectric power, completely renewable, and it's 25% the cost of doing it in Europe as a result. We will run our plant in Leipzig, which will run on wind power. And the whole business model is a very different one. So, traditionally you press panels, welded them, painted them, assembled them, shipped them to customers who bought them, leased them, and ultimately second and third and fourth, and ultimately they were scrapped. There is no welding plant for this. There is no pressings plant for this. There's minor paint shop for this. There will be very different sales models for this, and that is something which is part of this holistic approach. So it is one of born electric. Now that's a great phrase. I think so. I came up with it. So from our point of view, it will be the first car that has truly been developed for a new energy powertrain. Because all the products out there at the moment are modifications of existing products that have had a combustion engine taken out and ultimately an electric motor of some sort put in. In addition to that, the mobility services are increasing. We invested heavily in a company called My City Way. It's doing exceedingly well. which is an intermodal transportation. So unlike the past where we said IT is only what we do in the car, this is IT alongside the car and might not even involve it. Products like Drive Now, which is a car sharing model, has 30,000 active users now in the cities in Germany in which we run, and we are looking very closely at whether we can do it here in London. We will also roll out in the United States. And of course, all of these things are giving the consumer options. And they're giving them flexibility. And they're giving them solutions to problems that are showing themselves today, but ultimately maybe haven't manifested themselves. There is a theory that 30% of the traffic in London is people looking for a parking space. Think about it. Might not be too far from the truth. So we invested in a company called Park at My House here in London. They, or it, is a marketplace which brings people who've got a driveway they're not using during the day with someone who wants to park a car. And by the way, it's heavily, heavily used. And by the way, that reduces the time you take to find a parking space, because now you know where you're going to get it. And the entrepreneurs involved with that have started to Park at My House around Heathrow Airport, and they take people to the airport, and it's a fraction of the cost of parking at the airport. So new opportunities that come very much. Now, premium retail, and I see that you have alternative retail on the agenda later. I'll be very interested to see what that's about. But for us, the basic model of the car dealership has been one which has been probably intact for the last 80 years. Now, of course, the dealer model has got better and better and better, but the model is roughly the same. You know, people came into a showroom, they were engaged with seeing a product, and ultimately they went out having bought a product or leased it or whatever. And of course, that model changed from full ownership to hire purchase to leasing. But in the future, there are many, many ways that a consumer is going to have the information. In fact, we believe today that something like 80% of all the customers that ultimately come through the door of a dealership have all the information they need to make their decision already, and they've got it from the internet. So we've just relaunched our internet platforms, much more user-friendly, much more active and engaging. We are on Twitter and Facebook. We have more Facebook fans than any other car company. Today, I estimate around 10 million. I have to estimate because it moves at about 50, 60,000 a day. But it's around 10 million. What does that tell me? That tells me there are 10 million people on Facebook who are potential customers, but more importantly than that, I know who they are. Now, you know, we've all been involved in traditional advertising above the line, and we do great creativity, and we run campaigns on the TV or in cinema or on billboards all around, and we look at the post-rational statistics that said it was a fantastic campaign. And it probably was. But do I know who looked at it? No, I don't. And that is a very different place to where we're going to be in the future. Because actually interacting with our customers on a personal basis, which may be many, many years before they buy something, is a fundamental shift, which is being enabled by the technology that we have today. I think the ability for customers to experience is also going to take a big step forward. And we are in the process, and we launched a new brand store in Paris 2 weeks ago. We will open a new iBrand store in London tomorrow, where we will have a completely different platform on which people can experience the cars in the physical dealerships. And I have to say that the physical dealership is still the backbone of ultimately where someone will take the delivery of their car. And that is something which I think is fundamental. So the environment in which it operates is still fundamental to our success. So I won't talk more about that because I could talk for many hours, because it's a program I've been running for 2 years within BMW, and it's something which I think we'll now start to see very significant rollout in the next 15 months or so. So that's the iBrand showroom that we will show tomorrow. And very much, of course, we're 45 days from the Olympics here, and you will see many of the products, and this is the slight advertising, that we will have a fleet average of 116 grams, unimaginable 10 years ago with a fleet of BMWs, nearly 4,000 cars, but something we are very proud about. And the news out of this is that with our iBrand store tomorrow, not only is it the first in the world, and I think that's great that it's London, and I'm back to what I said at the start, it is the only mega city, but the engines for our i8 Super sports car will also be made in the UK. So that's another announcement that we made this morning. So a 3-cylinder gasoline engine with less than 3 litres per 100, which is 70 plus miles per gallon, and 0 to 100 kilometers in less than 5 seconds. And of course, I would say it, a design that is absolutely appropriate as well. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here in the UK, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Yeah, thank you very much.